Don't do it, man. What an ice hole. What happened in the year 1955? Everything I show you in this video is specific to the year 1955. Before the main feature, I'd like to tell you about the comics and cartoons that debuted this year. Comic strip debuts of 1955. Dondi. This comic strip had a long, respectable run from 1955 to 1986. Dondi had its followers, but the strip was never a huge smash success. It was about a war orphan who was adopted by an American soldier. Disney Scamp. Now this was a popular comic strip, and it ran from 1955 to 1988. It came out the same year Lady and the Tramp hit theaters. Scamp was their puppy, and he had all kinds of funny adventures. He also became very popular in comic books. The Femlin. To be honest, I don't know how to categorize this character. She is definitely comic-oriented, but she didn't appear in comic strips or comic books. Instead, she was a character you saw in the joke pages of Playboy magazine. This black and white character is a naked lady who wears opera gloves and thigh boots. She quickly became a very popular intellectual property of Playboy and has been heavily merchandised over the years. The Femlin is certainly an adult character and not intended for children in any way. Comic book debuts of 1955. DC Comics introduced their popular title, The Brave and the Bold. It was called this because the title originally focused on adventure tales from past ages like Robin Hood, knights, Vikings, and gladiators. It stayed that way until the 25th issue in 1959. Beginning with issue number 59, it became a Batman title that teamed him up with other characters. To this day, people think of The Brave and the Bold as a Batman comic. The Marvel publisher, which in 1955 was still called Atlas Comics, came out with two relevant titles this year. The Rawhide Kid was about a fictional Old West cowboy. These were good, exciting Western comic books. Marvel has brought back the character a number of times over the years. Atlas also created the first of their Black Knight characters in The Black Knight No. 1. The first Black Knight was a hero by the name of Sir Percy. Believe it or not, most of Marvel's Black Knight characters are villains. However, Marvel's most popular Black Knight character is their third version, a hero by the name of Dane Whitman, who was a descendant of the original hero. This Black Knight also became a member of the Avengers superhero team, but the saga of Marvel's Black Knight legacy began in 1955. Cartoon debuts of 1955. Disney's Lady and the Tramp. This animated feature film is probably one of Disney's most fun cartoon movies. Gumby. Art Clokey's famous clay animation character debuted this year. The very first Saturday morning cartoon show, The Mighty Mouse Playhouse, debuted this year on CBS. Cartoons had been shown on TV before this, but never expressly as a Saturday morning cartoon. This show played Terrytoons cartoons including Mighty Mouse, Heckle and Jekyll, and many others. The one-shot cartoon from Looney Tunes called The Whole Idea is released. It was directed and animated almost entirely by the legendary Robert McKimson. Most one-shot cartoons aren't long remembered, but this is familiar to just about everyone who has even a faint interest in Looney Tunes. A scientist invents portable holes. A thief steals his invention and uses it for a crime spree, but everything works out in the end. A successful one-shot from Merry Melodies, the sister series of Looney Tunes, was called One Froggy Evening. It introduced the character of Michigan J. Frog, a super talented singing and dancing frog who would perform for only one person. This came from director Chuck Jones. The famous frog went on to become a very popular Looney Tunes character, particularly in merchandising, despite being in only one cartoon. He also did not have a name for many years. The first time he was given any kind of a name was in a 1960 episode of The Bugs Bunny Show, where he was referred to as Enrico, in allusion to the opera singer Enrico Caruso. This didn't stick. Chuck Jones thought up the name Michigan Frog in the 1970s, naming him after the song The Michigan Rag. Jones later added the J as a middle initial because it sounded funny. A sequel cartoon called Another Froggy Evening was released in 1995, but isn't remembered nearly as well as the original. That same year, however, Michigan J. Frog became the mascot of the WB network and held that position through 2005, a little over a year before it became known as the CW network. Looney Tunes and Merry Melodies were on a roll this year. Speedy Gonzales had made one appearance before this year in the 1953 cartoon Cat Tales for Two. Although that cartoon was hilarious, Speedy looked and acted radically different. The only thing that connected the Speedy we know today to the one in the past is that he ran fast. Director Friz Freleng redesigned the character to make him look cuter and debuted the cartoon Speedy Gonzales in 1955. Sylvester the Cat was established as Speedy's regular foil. The cartoon was a hit and the first in a long series. Tex Avery, the iconic cartoon director, made his very last cartoon before retirement. It was for Walter Lantz Studios and called Shh. At least he retired with a bang. This cartoon is awesome. A man with shattered nerves goes to a peace and quiet hotel only to be constantly disturbed by noisy neighbors. The final twist is one that will stay with you. This same year, and also for Walter Lantz, Tex Avery created the characters of Maggie and Sam. They made their debut in Crazy Mixed Up Pup. Maggie is tall, fat, and domineering, while Sam is short and meek. These characters were hilarious, but only made cartoons through 1957. Although they are rather minor characters for Walter Lantz, their cartoons are very well remembered, particularly the one mentioned. MGM released the Tom and Jerry cartoon Pecos Pest. It featured the only appearance of Jerry's Uncle Pecos, the country musician. This character, voiced by comedian Chug Fisher, has been remembered for years, particularly for his song Crambone and using Tom's whiskers for guitar strings. A few other big events of 1955. Disneyland opened in Anaheim, California on July 17, 1955. It was a hugely publicized event, and a lot of things went wrong. However, all these problems were quickly resolved, and the theme park became an enormous success. Ray Kroc opens his first McDonald's restaurant on April 15, 1955, in Des Plaines, Illinois. The Rosa Parks incident happens on December 1, 1955. She is arrested for refusing to surrender her seat on the bus to a white person. The same thing happened to a 15-year-old black girl by the name of Claudette Colvin much earlier, on March 2nd of that year, in the same city of Montgomery, Alabama. For some reason, Claudette Colvin never got the press that Rosa Parks did. Colvin's case, however, led to bus segregation being ruled as unconstitutional. General Motors became the first American corporation to make over $1 billion in a year. The 1950s is famous for its cars, and the most famous car of 1955, if not of all time, is the 1955 Chevrolet. There were three basic models: the 150, which was their entry level, the 210, which was their mid-range, and the Bel Air that had more chrome than the previous two. They also made the classic Nomad station wagon this year, as well as their sedan delivery. It was the first truly new car from Chevrolet in a long time, and there was a bunch of things about it that people liked. The body style was catchy. It came in a wide array of colors, but the small block Chevy V8 engine became the desired engine for generations of gearheads. The 1955 Chevy sold extremely well, and the other car manufacturers, including Ford, really felt the bite. Popular tunes of 1955. There were many popular songs this year, but I'm going to talk about some of the most notable. This was the year that rock and roll hit its stride. Bill Haley and his Comets released Rock Around the Clock, and it's credited for really bringing in the rock and roll era. It was originally released in 1954 as a B-side to their single 13 Women. The single didn't necessarily flop, but it was a commercial disappointment. Then, in 1955, it was played in the popular movie Blackboard Jungle and became a monster hit. Upon re-release, the record did extremely well. As a matter of fact, it became the top-selling record of that year. Okay, Elvis. Everybody wants to know about Elvis Presley. He was certainly around in 1955, but 1956 would become his first big year. Although not yet the king, he was certainly on his way to the coronation. 1955 saw Elvis produce 2 singles for Sun Records. The first was I'm Left, You're Right, She's Gone, backed with Baby Let's Play House. His second that year was I Forgot to Remember to Forget, backed with Mystery Train. His second single this year was the last one he made for Sun Records before he moved to RCA Records. I Forgot to Remember to Forget also became Elvis's first #1 record nationally on the Billboard country charts. However, that success did not come until February of 1956, about 6 months after he released it. The most amusing thing of all is that the B-sides of these 2 singles, Baby Let's Play House and Mystery Train, are far better known than the A-sides. What other big rock and roll songs came out in 1955? Bo Diddley had a busy year. He had 3 singles, with the biggest hit being called Bo Diddley. He also appeared on The Ed Sullivan Show. The Platters released Only You and You Alone and The Great Pretender. The Crew Cuts released their classic version of Earth Angel, which had been previously recorded by the Penguins in 1954. I think both versions are great. Little Richard came out with Tutti Frutti. Fats Domino had a great hit with Ain't That a Shame. Big Joe Turner released Flip, Flop, and Fly. Chuck Berry, who had become famous for a long string of hit songs, really knocked it out of the park with Maybelline. Gail Storm made the hit record I Hear You Knocking. And now, the peculiar history of Unchained Melody. This song has a weird history for sure. It was originally performed by Todd Duncan for a prison film called Unchained, hence the title of the song, Unchained Melody. It could have just as easily been named Unchained Theme. If you've ever heard this classic song, and I'm sure you have, and wondered why it was called Unchained Melody, now you know. In the same year of 1955, there were 5 high-charting covers of this song by Les Baxter, Al Hibbler, Roy Hamilton, Jimmy Young, and Liberace. A lot of people just really liked recording this song, and they usually had success with it. But no one was as successful with this song as the Righteous Brothers would be in 1965. Ever since they did it, it became the Righteous Brothers song. Unchained Melody has been recorded hundreds of times, but it will always be known as the Righteous Brothers song. In reality, however, the song had already been around for a decade before they got to it. But what popular songs of 1955 were not rock and roll songs? Since rock and roll had not been around all that long, there were still a ton of other songs out there that made it big. Here are some of those top hits. Sincerely by the McGuire Sisters. This song was originally recorded by the Moonglows in 1954. It was also recorded by the McGuire Sisters that same year. Although it entered the charts in 1954, it did not become a #1 pop hit until 1955. My father remembered that when Sincerely first came out, it was a huge, huge hit. You heard it everywhere. People talked about it. It was just a very big, well-liked song. The Ballad of Davy Crockett by Bill Hayes. It was introduced on Disney's Davy Crockett TV show in 1954 and became a hit record in 1955. This song is still very popular and better known than the man who sang it. There have been many cover versions and parodies. If personal opinion accounts for anything, I really like the Kentucky Headhunters version from 1991. And then there are these hits. 16 Tons by Tennessee Ernie Ford. Cherry Pink and Apple Blossom White by Perez Prado. Love is a Many-Splendored Thing by the Four Aces. Folsom Prison Blues by Johnny Cash. Let Me Go, Lover by Joan Weber. Hearts of Stone by the Fontaine Sisters. The Yellow Rose of Texas by Mitch Miller. Autumn Leaves by Roger Williams. The Crazy Auto Medley by Johnny Maddox. Cry Me a River by Julie London. And Tweedledee by Laverne Baker. TV debuts of 1955. Adventure shows. Alfred Hitchcock Presents. Captain Gallant of the Foreign Legion. Buster Crabbe was a star, along with his son Cullen. Is there any kind of part Buster Crabbe didn't play? Highway Patrol. Jungle Jim. Johnny Weissmuller reprised his role of Jungle Jim after having played him in 16 movies. Before that, he was Tarzan. Jungle Jim was a popular comic strip character before the movies and TV show. The TV series lasted only a season, but along with the movies and comic strip did its job in keeping the character in the memories of many baby boomers for decades to come. Sheena, Queen of the Jungle. Although it lasted for only one season in syndication, this TV show, based on the comic book character, still has a faithful cult following. It made the career of model actress Irish McCalla. She proudly celebrated the character for the rest of her life. Children's shows. Andy's Gang. Andy Devine's children's show. Captain Kangaroo. Bob Keeshan was and will always be Captain Kangaroo. The show ran until 1992, and countless people grew up watching him, myself included. Thump your head on the table if you like Bunny Rabbit. Mickey Mouse Club. Wow, was this show huge, and it's had a number of revivals. The original series ran from 1955 to 59 and had all kinds of unique features. My dad loved Spin and Marty. What was your favorite? Sam and Friends. Jim Henson's first TV series. It started everything with the Muppets. This local show from Washington, D.C. became a phenomenon and led to greater things. And yes, it did feature Kermit. However, it would not be established that Kermit was a frog until 1969. He was originally presented as a lizard of sorts. The series ended in 1961, but the Muppets just kept getting more and more popular. The Broadway musical of Peter Pan, starring Mary Martin, aired on TV for the first time as a special and was a huge hit for NBC. It also established Mary Martin as the most popular person to play Peter Pan. Comedy shows. Bob Cummings Show. Later known as Love That Bob in reruns, this show was a huge hit. Eddie Cantor Comedy Theater. The hugely successful vaudeville star made this series for only one season in first-run syndication. It only ended because Cantor himself decided to end it. The reason? It was hard for him to keep up with it. Running and starring in your own TV show is a lot of work, and he had been performing for decades already. After this, he stuck to guest starring in TV shows. The Honeymooners. Although this series lasted for only one season of 39 episodes, it's one of the most popular TV series ever made, and has had surprising longevity in TV reruns. Jackie Gleason had been doing the Honeymooner skits for quite a while before this series, and he continued to do them years after this ended. But this series is the one that every Honeymooners fan remembers. Johnny Carson Show. Long before his time as The Tonight Show host, Carson hosted this half-hour variety series in primetime. It lasted only one season, but it got him noticed and led to greater things. Phil Silver Show. Probably remembered best as Sergeant Bilko. This show was so popular that it has inspired many imitators. The premise of the Big Idea Man and his group of followers continues to be used in comedy shows. McHale's Navy, beginning in 1962, is probably the best example of this. The classic cartoon show Top Cat from 1961 was directly inspired by the Phil Silver Show. Music shows. Eddie Arnold Time. Ozark Jubilee. This popular country music show was renamed to Country Music Jubilee in 1957, and finally Jubilee USA in 1958. It ran through 1960. Perry Como Show. The Lawrence Welk Show. Westerns. Adventures of Champion. The main character of this series was Gene Autry's horse Champion, with no Gene Autry in sight. Fury. Another Western show with the horse as the main character. Cheyenne with Clint Walker. Gunsmoke. This show became insanely popular and is one of the most famous TV shows to debut this year. The Life and Legend of Wyatt Earp. Said to be the first TV Western written expressly for adults. Before that, a lot of Westerns were aimed at kids. This aired 4 days before Gunsmoke and 2 weeks before Cheyenne. Tales of the Texas Rangers. Other notable TV debuts. The Game Show, The $64,000 Question. The science fiction show, Commando Cody, Sky Marshal of the Universe. Last, but not least, the movies of 1955. There were many, many movies released in 1955. This is an overview of the movies that were the most popular and those that are otherwise noteworthy. Abbott and Costello. They had 2 films this year. Abbott and Costello Meet the Keystone Cops, and Abbott and Costello Meet the Mummy. The Keystone Cops one, I think, is especially cool because it features cameos by original Keystone Cops producer Max Sennett and 3 of the Keystone Cops actors, Hank Mann, Heine Conklin, and Harold Goodwin. Martin and Lewis. This team also had 2 films in 1955, You're Never Too Young and Artisan Models. By the next year, the classic team of Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis split up. In an unusual twist to the classic team splitting up story, both of them, not just one, went on to greater fame and success. Other comedy movies. Francis and the Navy, the 6th film in the popular Francis the Talking Mule series. Ma and Pa Kettle at Waikiki, the 8th film in the popular Ma and Pa Kettle series. How to Be Very, Very Popular. This would be Betty Grable's final film role. She died in 1973. The movie made money at the time and starred a number of big names, but it didn't leave a long-lasting impression on audiences. The 7 Little Foys. Bob Hope starred as real-life vaudeville star Eddie Foy in this comedy film about the legend and his 7 children who became part of the act. The film was actually narrated by Charlie Foy, the second oldest of the children. The 7-Year Itch. The Marilyn Monroe movie that features her most iconic scene, standing on a subway grating with the white dress blowing above her knees. We're No Angels. When you think Humphrey Bogart, you don't think Christmas comedy film, but that's exactly what this was. He and Peter Ustinov headed a big-name cast in this commercially successful movie. Adventure movies. The Adventures of Captain Africa. This superhero movie serial was meant to be a sequel to The Phantom from 1943. What Columbia Pictures discovered is that their film rights to the character expired and King Features wanted too much money. Instead, Columbia ripped off The Phantom with their own Captain Africa character, reusing a lot of footage from the Phantom serial. A lot of people see this as a remake instead of a sequel. Each of the 15 chapters uses only a few minutes of new footage. This probably gets more attention than it deserves, only for the fact that it is tied to the Phantom character. It stars John Hart, the other Lone Ranger. Panther Girl of the Congo. Phyllis Coates is the title character in this jungle adventure movie serial. Movie serials, on the whole, were coming to an end. The last movie serial would be in 1956. At this time, the few serials still being made used a lot of stock footage. Panther Girl of the Congo was no exception and used a lot of footage from the much earlier Jungle Girl from 1941. Phyllis Coates is very sexy as the Panther Girl, and this serial has the addition of giant crayfish monsters. It's been better received over the years than it was at the time and seems to be one of those so bad it's good movies. One thing I will say, however, is that the acting is generally pretty good. Myron Healy, who is the male lead in this serial, is great to see as a good guy. He usually got pinned down to villain parts. Arthur Space is as mean of a mad scientist as you could hope for. Phyllis Coates herself was always a good actress. Her character seems mostly competent, but she has a penchant for getting knocked out a lot. Hey, heroes and heroines got knocked out a lot in Golden Age cinema. To Catch a Thief. It was directed by Alfred Hitchcock and stars Cary Grant and Grace Kelly. This romantic thriller film sparks a lot of imitators. This movie made the whole idea of a cat burglar who is really a good guy a popular story device. Bad Day at Black Rock. A one-armed stranger comes to a small desert town and turns the community on its ear. A number of big stars were in this one, including Spencer Tracy, Walter Brennan, Ernest Borgnine, and Lee Marvin. Anne Francis and John Erickson, also in this film, would be the stars of the TV series Honey West a decade later. Captain Lightfoot, with Rock Hudson and Barbara Rush. Set in early 1800s Ireland, the member of an Irish Revolutionary Society turns into a highwayman to support it, becoming an outlaw. He robs the wealthy and finds romance. It's like an Irish Robin Hood story. Kiss Me Deadly. This movie features the popular detective character Mike Hammer. Although it made money in theaters, critics really hated it. Some people claimed it was designed to be a bad influence on the youth of America. Despite all this, it has become one of the most important, influential, and best-liked detective movies of all time. And it certainly didn't hurt the Mike Hammer franchise. Night of the Hunter. Wow, this movie was controversial all over the place. Robert Mitchum played a serial killer disguised as a preacher. Catholics condemned it. It was a critical and commercial flop. This was the only film directed by legendary actor Charles Laughton. For many years after this, it was considered a cult film. Since then, it became an undisputed classic. In the 1950s, it was a dangerous thing for your career to toy with elements of religion. Son of Sinbad. This Sinbad movie, from Howard Hughes, was made to be quite a spectacle. Besides all the exciting fantasy action, there were over 127 women. At the time, it was deemed too sexy and was actually condemned by the Catholic Legion of Decency. Catholics were very busy that year banning movies. Bingo nights must have been getting dull. Women's Prison. This wasn't the very first women in prison movie, but it was an early entry. Movies of this sort became a lot more popular in the 1970s and 80s. Ida Lupino plays the sadistic superintendent of a women's prison. At the time, it came and went without a lot of notice. Since then, with the popularity of the more recent, really sleazy women in prison films, it has become a classic. Westerns. Chief Crazy Horse with Victor Mature. Davy Crockett, King of the Wild Frontier. The first of Disney's 2 Davy Crockett movies with Fess Parker. The first movie is actually a re-edit of the first 3 episodes of the Davy Crockett TV miniseries that first aired in 1954. The Kentuckian with Burt Lancaster. The Man from Laramie with James Stewart. Man with the Gun with Robert Mitchum. Rage at Dawn with Randolph Scott. This exciting western was about the real-life outlaw gang called the Reno Brothers. While this film did alright in theaters and is still considered a classic, a much more successful version of the Reno Brothers story was released the next year, starring Elvis Presley and called Love Me Tender. The Tall Men with Clark Gable and Jane Russell. The Treasure of Pancho Villa with Rory Calhoun and Shelley Winters. The Violent Men with Glenn Ford, Barbara Stanwyck, Edward G. Robinson, and Brian Keith. Wichita. This movie did well in theaters, but it's a little surprising that it isn't known better today. Joel McCrea plays Wyatt Earp in this all-star cast that manages to include other real-life cowboy legends like Earp's brothers and Bat Masterson. Horror and science fiction movies. In the 1950s, the 2 genres of horror and science fiction often merged into one. Mythical magical monsters weren't as common as man-made menaces. Godzilla Raids Again. This sequel to the original Godzilla film was released in Japan. It wouldn't see American release in English until 1959. Revenge of the Creature. The sequel to The Creature from the Black Lagoon from the previous year. Tarantula. A movie about a giant spider. It was a big hit and had a lot of name actors. People you saw a lot in films and television of the 1950s and 60s. Day the World Ended. Although an independent film directed by Roger Corman, legendary for his B movies, it did pretty well at the time and continues to have its fans. The star was Richard Denning, a very good actor who already had a prolific career up to this point. There were actually a number of name actors and actresses in this post-apocalyptic science fiction movie, including Mike Connors, who would have great success much later on with the TV series Mannix. The Beast with a Million Eyes. Another Roger Corman sci-fi B movie that did fairly well at the time, but remained somewhat well known in the decades that followed thanks to home video releases. It Came from Beneath the Sea. A giant octopus attacks the West Coast. This did extremely well in theaters. The Phantom from 10,000 Leagues. A radioactive man monster is killing people at sea. This B movie actually has a good cast and did well at theaters. Critics don't like it, but they don't like much of anything. When the movie entered the public domain, it didn't do anything but become even more watched by fans of old monster movies. Love it or hate it, this movie is still a part of 1950s pop culture. Drama and romance movies. East of Eden. James Dean's first major role, set during the time of World War I in 1917. Rebel Without a Cause. The famous James Dean movie, released in theaters almost a month after his fatal car accident. Teenage rebellion was a popular movie topic at the time. It would become only more popular when rock and roll music grew in popularity. Blackboard Jungle. A very popular film at the time, but not as talked about today as Rebel Without a Cause. But it also dealt with troubled youth. The whole idea of an inner-city classroom became heavily recycled in movies and television, be they dramas or comedies. It's notable for a lot of things, not the least of which is its use of rock and roll in the soundtrack. Bill Haley's Rock Around the Clock, originally a B-side record, was played over the credits and became a monster hit. This movie actually marked the rock and roll revolution. The slang term daddy-o came from this movie. It also produced a breakout star with Sidney Poitier, who only became more distinguished as time went on. A number of big name and soon-to-be big name actors were in this movie. The Man with the Golden Arm. Frank Sinatra starred in this drama film about a drug addict who gets clean in prison, but struggles to stay that way in the outside world. The specific drug is never mentioned, but assumed to be heroin. This movie was highly controversial at the time due to the taboo topic of drug addiction. It was also a box office success. All That Heaven Allows, starring Rock Hudson and Jane Wyman. The story was about the romance between a well-to-do widow and a younger man. A lot of notable people were in the cast. Some of them would become more famous as time went on, like Agnes Moorehead, who played Endora on Bewitched, Hayden Rourke, who played Bellows on I Dream of Jeannie, and David Janssen, star of The Fugitive. Love is a Many Splendored Thing, starring William Holden and Jennifer Jones. Mr. Roberts. This comedy-drama movie about the Navy set in the later days of World War II was a monster hit and featured an all-star cast. As a matter of fact, there were very few people in this movie who weren't at least moderately famous. Any movie that makes 10 times its budget has to be labeled a success. The Virgin Queen. Bette Davis stars as Queen Elizabeth I, with Joan Collins as Elizabeth Throckmorton, one of her ladies-in-waiting. Musicals. Oklahoma. Very few things can be so equally celebrated and insulted as Oklahoma. It's like an anti-Western. There isn't much in the way of violence, and there's a whole lot of romance. Both of these things are looked down upon by most Western movie watchers. Despite a lot of love from film critics, this movie wasn't a major moneymaker for the money that was put into it. It's one of those things that people have loved even more with time, and people still like the Broadway musical on which it's based. For people who like those grisly shoot-'em-ups, this movie is about as lame as they come. Guys and Dolls, with Marlon Brando and Frank Sinatra. Daddy Longlegs, with Fred Astaire and Leslie Caron. My Sister Eileen, with Janet Leigh and Jack Lemmon. Film debuts of 1955. All of these people would eventually become superstars, but not all of their film debuts were very noticeable. Clint Eastwood in Revenge of the Creature as the lab technician Jennings in an uncredited role. This was a productive year for him, as he also had parts in 3 other movies. Dennis Hopper in Rebel Without a Cause as Goon. Jill Ireland in No Love for Judy as the Other Woman. This was a good year for her in films, as she had 3 more roles. She would later become the wife of actor David McCallum, and, more famously, the future Mrs. Charles Bronson. Shirley Jones in Oklahoma as the female lead Lori Williams. Shirley was a good actress from the start, and I'm not surprised that she had such a long and varied career. Cloris Leachman in Kiss Me Deadly as Christina Bailey, the murder victim. Shirley MacLaine in The Trouble with Harry as Jennifer Rogers. Jane Mansfield in Female Jungle as Candy Price. She was not intended to be the female lead, but certainly became a standout. Jane Mansfield was cool and deserved her success. Unlike the infamous label that some people have pinned on her, she was no poor man's Marilyn Monroe. Walter Matthau in The Kentuckian as Stan Bodine, a whip-wielding bad guy. Matthau was locked into bad guy parts for a long time, but would ultimately become known as a funny man. Sal Mineo in Six Bridges to Cross as Young Jerry. Elizabeth Montgomery in The Court Martial of Billy Mitchell as Mrs. Margaret Lansdowne. Vic Morrow in Blackboard Jungle as Artie West. Jerry Orbach in Marty as ballroom extra, an uncredited part. Maximilian Schell in Children, Mother, and the General as Deserter. Joanne Woodward in Count Three and Pray as Lissy. Many thanks for watching. I hope you liked it. If you saw this video all the way through, without skipping around, you're cooler than Clint Eastwood on a talking mule at an Elvis concert with Marilyn Monroe. If you didn't get all that, go back and watch the whole thing. Join my gang of cool kids, and come back anytime when you want to visit the year 1955.
Sincerely, oh yes, sincerely, 'cause I love you so dearly. Please say you'll be mine.